Welcome, dear listeners. Your support means the world to me, and I want to invite you to subscribe and hit the bell icon to enjoy more original stories every week. The Inspector Price Mystery Series is a trademarked original, available exclusively on this channel. Settle in, the mystery awaits. Murder Beneath the Desert Sun. Chapter 1. A Call from Whitehall. It was a typical cold English morning when Inspector Harold Price of Scotland Yard quickened his pace along Whitehall. Price, a tall man, with a neatly trimmed moustache and an eye for small detail, was not given to hurrying unless there was reason. Today, there was. A curtly worded note from the Under-Secretary of the Foreign Office, delivered to his lodgings at dawn, had requested his immediate attendance on a matter of some delicacy. The great stone facade of the Foreign Office loomed ahead, its entrance flanked by solemn guards in full dress. Price presented his credentials and was swiftly shown into the echoing corridors. His footsteps softened by thick carpets. A young clerk with ink-stained fingers led him to a polished oak door, rapped lightly, and ushered him inside. The room was warm, a welcome change from the damp chill outside. A coal fire burned in the grate, and behind a wide desk sat Sir Reginald Chalmers, the Under-Secretary himself, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, and with the kind of watchful eyes that suggested little escaped his notice. "Ah, Price," Sir Reginald said, motioning to a chair. "Do sit. I trust you've not had breakfast. I imagine this will be more invigorating than kippers." "I am at your disposal, sir," Price replied, settling into the leather seat. Sir Reginald steepled his fingers. "You are aware, I presume, of Sir Charles Winthrop, the archaeologist?" Price nodded. "His excavations in the Valley of the Kings have been in the papers." "Quite. A most distinguished scholar. I'm afraid he is dead." Price's brow furrowed. "An accident?" "That is the official story," Sir Reginald said dryly. "The Egyptian authorities are content to call it heat stroke. He was found near the excavation site, alone, in the middle of the day, with the sun at its worst. But certain details do not sit well. The Consulate reports that Sir Charles had made a discovery of significant importance. Precisely what, no one seems willing to say. His personal papers are missing, and," Sir Reginald leaned forward, "several of his colleagues are behaving rather oddly." Price absorbed this in silence. "And you want me to investigate?" "Discreetly," Sir Reginald said. "The last thing we need is a diplomatic scandal. You will travel as a cultural attaché for the Consulate. Officially, you are there to assist in cataloguing certain finds. Unofficially," he paused, "you will determine whether Sir Charles's death was indeed an unfortunate accident or something far darker." Price inclined his head. "When do I leave?" "Tomorrow morning. Passage on the SS Olympia. She sails from Tilbury at first light. Our consul in Alexandria, Henry Blackwood, will meet you at the dock. I've asked Miss Clara White, Sir Charles's assistant, to assist you. She is a capable young woman, but perhaps not entirely forthcoming." Sir Reginald rose, signalling the meeting's end. "Oh, and Price—" "Yes, sir. Be careful. There are whispers of stolen artifacts, smuggling to the continent, and, if you can believe it, a curse. Utter nonsense, of course, but dangerous nonsense. Egypt is a place where myth can be as lethal as any blade." By late afternoon, Price was back at his modest flat methodically packing his case. He tucked his revolver into a leather holster at the bottom, covered by shirts and a worn copy of The Complete Works of Shakespeare. On his desk lay the official papers for his cover identity, a small stack of Egyptian banknotes, and the note from Sir Reginald, now carefully folded into his pocketbook. That evening, as the fog thickened and the lamplighters made their rounds, Price allowed himself a final stroll along the embankment. He paused by the dark, glistening waters of the Thames, thinking of the days ahead. Egypt, land of pharaohs and pyramids, sand and sun, but also a land of rivalries, secrets buried deep, and, if the rumours were true, a murder to be solved beneath the relentless desert sun. The inspector turned up his collar against the chill. Tomorrow London's grey mists would give way to blinding gold, and somewhere in that blaze the truth awaited. Chapter 2. Arrival in Alexandria. The SS Olympia cut through the gentle swells of the Mediterranean like a polished knife. For days, Inspector Harold Price had stood on her deck, the salt air sharp in his lungs, the endless water giving way at last to a faint smudge of coastline. By mid-morning on the 13th day, that smudge had grown into the hazy outline of Alexandria, its pale buildings shimmering in the rising heat, minarets pricking the sky, and the long curve of the harbour stretching like an open arm. As the ship eased into port, the air became alive with sound. The raucous cries of dock workers, the braying of donkeys, the clatter of wooden carts over stone, the sing-song calls of vendors hawking spices, dates and bolts of vivid cloth, a tang of salt mingled with scents of cumin, roasting coffee, and something faintly acrid that Price could not place. At the foot of the gangway, a lean, well-dressed man in a cream suit was waiting, his straw boater held in one hand, the other resting on an ebony-handled cane. His sharp features were tanned, his hair greying at the temples. "Inspector Price, I presume?" the man called in a clipped accent. "Indeed," Price replied, descending with measured steps. "Henry Blackwood, His Majesty's consul here in Alexandria. Welcome to Egypt. I trust the voyage was tolerable?" "Uneventful," Price said, "which is more than can be said for the matter that brings me." Blackwood's mouth curved in a humourless smile. "Quite. Let us not discuss it here. The harbour is a marvellous place for fish, and a terrible one for secrets." A waiting motor car whisked them away from the bustle of the docks and into the winding streets of the European quarter. Elegant cafes shaded by striped awnings sat alongside bookshops with French signs, while the humbler native quarter, visible beyond, was a riot of narrow lanes and colourful stalls. As they drove, Blackwood filled him in on the basics. Sir Charles Winthrop's death was inconvenient. Officially, heat stroke. Unofficially, I think we both know better. The Egyptian authorities are content to leave matters there. They have no wish to stir trouble among the foreign archaeological community. But certain things trouble me. Papers missing from his tent. A quarrel 2 days before his death between Sir Charles and a rival, Professor Lucien Armand. And of course, the whispers. "Of a curse?" Price asked dryly. Blackwood gave a brief laugh. "Ah, you've heard. Yes, the local workers speak of a guardian spirit, angered by the opening of the tomb. I don't give it credence, but such talk can be dangerous here. It sows fear, and fear drives men to folly." They pulled up outside the British Consulate, a handsome sandstone building with carved wooden shutters, and a flag fluttering lazily in the heat. Inside, the cool air was scented faintly of lemon oil. A young woman rose from behind a desk as they entered. She was tall, with an air of quiet determination in her posture. Her eyes, clear grey, with a hint of reserve, regarded Price steadily. "Inspector Price, this is Miss Clara White," Blackwood said. "She served as Sir Charles's assistant for the past 3 years." "A pleasure, Miss White," Price said, offering a hand. Her handshake was firm. "Likewise, Inspector. I wish the circumstances were better." "I understand you were with Sir Charles the day he died." Her gaze flickered. "Yes, but I wasn't present at the moment itself. I was cataloguing finds in the storage tent. When I went to speak with him, I found him collapsed in the sand. The heat was dreadful that day." "Dreadful enough to kill a man accustomed to it?" Price asked mildly. Clara's lips pressed together, but she did not answer at once. "Sir Charles was in good health. I can't explain it. All I know is, he seemed troubled in the days before his death." Blackwood cleared his throat. "You'll have plenty of time to go over the details with Inspector Price, Clara. For now, I suggest he settle into his lodgings. Shepheard's Hotel has your room prepared. It's the sort of place where half the world's gossip changes hands over tea." That evening, Price took a short walk from the hotel into the heart of the city. Alexandria glowed in the sunset, the sky a sheet of gold melting into crimson, and the masts of fishing boats outlined against the fiery horizon. Somewhere in that beauty lurked the truth about Sir Charles's death, and tomorrow Under the full glare of the desert sun, he would begin to look for it. Chapter 3. The Sunlit Trap. The morning broke cloudless, the sun already fierce as it crept above the low, dun-coloured rooftops of Cairo. Inspector Price, hat firmly in place, joined Henry Blackwood and Clara White for the journey upriver to the excavation site. A motor car carried them to the station, where a small weather-beaten train waited, its carriages painted a faded green, the windows clouded with dust. "From Cairo to Luxor will take the better part of the day," Blackwood said, handing Price a flask of cool water. "And from there, another hour by river to the site. The Nile will be a welcome sight by then." The rhythmic clatter of the train carried them southward, through palm groves and fields, where men in loose robes bent to tend crops, water buffalo standing motionless in the shallows. Price found his gaze drawn often to Clara White. She spoke little, her attention fixed on the passing scenery, but there was a quiet composure about her, as if she were keeping her thoughts carefully locked away. By mid-afternoon they boarded a small felucca with a single white sail, its canvas taut in the steady breeze. The Nile, broad and placid, glinted beneath the sun, its banks dotted with fishermen casting nets and children waving from the shore. As they drew closer to the western bank, the land rose into a sweep of ochre cliffs, the entrance to the fabled Valley of the Kings. The dig site lay in a shallow basin between ridges of rock. Canvas tents flapped in the dry wind, and men moved between them carrying baskets of sand. The heat struck Price like a physical blow the moment he stepped ashore. Even with the brim of his hat pulled low, the glare was near blinding. Colonel James Rutherford, a tall man with the solid build of a former soldier, strode forward to greet them. His sunburnt face was set in a frown. "Inspector Price, I presume. Pity you're not here under more agreeable circumstances." "Death seldom makes for agreeable circumstances," Price replied evenly. Rutherford gestured toward the largest of the tents. "Sir Charles was found just beyond that rise. I'll show you." They climbed a short incline, the sand crunching underfoot. The spot where Sir Charles had died was unremarkable, a patch of level ground baked hard by the sun, but Price studied it as though it were a London drawing-room after a crime. "His body was here?" "Face down," Rutherford confirmed. "Hat nearby. No sign of injury. The local doctor said it was heat stroke." Price crouched, brushing the surface with a gloved hand. The sand here was slightly disturbed, as if by more than one set of feet. He noticed a faint trail of footprints leading away toward the Nile, already blurred by the wind, but distinct enough to note. "And this?" Price asked, his hand closing around something half buried. He drew it out, a small carved amulet in the shape of a falcon, its surface worn smooth with age. Rutherford shook his head. "Not catalogued among the finds. Could have been dropped by anyone. There's no shortage of trinkets for sale to gullible tourists." Price slipped the amulet into a small pouch. Or perhaps it wasn't meant to be dropped at all. They moved to the storage tent, where tables groaned under trays of pottery shards, gold leaf fragments, and pieces of worked stone. Here Clara White's reserve seemed to crack. Her eyes lit with something between reverence and protectiveness as she moved among the finds. "These pieces," she said quietly, "are over 3,000 years old. Some of them were in the burial chamber Sir Charles was excavating. He was convinced there was a hidden passage, something the original builders had concealed even from the priests of the time." "Did he tell anyone else this?" Price asked. "No," she said, glancing at Rutherford. "He trusted very few." "And yet," Price murmured, "someone knew enough to silence him." Late in the day, Price asked to see the archaeologist's private tent. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with dust. A cot stood neatly made, a small writing table against one wall. Price examined the desk. Its contents were sparse: a pen, several envelopes, and a battered leather-bound notebook. He turned the pages slowly. Dates, sketches of hieroglyphics, and detailed notes on the dig. But then, a sudden gap, 2 pages missing, torn cleanly from the binding. Do you know what was on these pages, Miss White? Clara shook her head, but Price noticed the flicker in her eyes before she looked away. Outside, the desert wind picked up, whistling through the guy ropes. Somewhere beyond the tents, a workman shouted, a short, startled cry, before the camp fell abruptly silent. Price straightened. What was that? Rutherford frowned. Stay here. He strode off toward the sound. A moment later, he returned, his expression grim. One of the workers says he saw a light, bright as a lantern, moving inside the sealed tomb chamber last night. Swears it was no man's doing. Price exchanged a look with Clara White. Then he said softly, we must find out whose doing it truly was. Chapter 4. Secrets at Shepheard's. The train from Luxor pulled into Cairo shortly after sunset, its iron wheels shrieking protest as it slowed. Even at this hour, the city was alive. Hawkers crying out beneath the flicker of oil lamps. The scent of roasting meat and cardamom coffee heavy in the warm air. Price, tired from the long journey, allowed himself a brief glance at the bustling streets before stepping into the waiting carriage arranged by the Consulate. His destination was Shepheard's Hotel, a grand pale-fronted building whose colonnaded entrance glowed under rows of lanterns. The place was an institution, famed throughout the empire. Diplomats, fortune-seekers, explorers, and the occasional con-man all passed through its doors. Tonight, a trio of military officers in khaki lounged on the veranda, puffing cigars and swapping exaggerated tales. Inside, the air was cooler, tinged faintly with sandalwood. Red Turkish carpets ran the length of the marble-floored lobby, where a fountain burbled gently in the centre. Bellboys in white jackets scurried between guests, and from the bar drifted the low hum of conversation and the clink of crystal. Price's room was on the second floor, a spacious suite with tall windows that opened onto a balcony overlooking the street. The lounge at Shepheard's was the very heart of Cairo's foreign gossip. The tables were scattered with newspapers in several languages, and here and there small knots of men and women leaned close over their drinks, speaking in low tones. Price took a seat at a corner table with a clear view of the room. He ordered a whiskey and allowed himself the appearance of idle interest, while his ears worked harder than his eyes. The conversations flowed like overlapping currents. Talk of an Italian merchant caught smuggling ivory, of a young Austrian prince sighted in the company of a notorious dancer, and, more pertinent, of trouble at the dig. Two men in well-tailored suits at the next table drew his attention. They spoke in French, but Price's grasp of the language was more than adequate. Armand is furious, one was saying. He swears the Englishman was about to claim the find as his own, and that he, cut him out of the picture entirely. And now? The other replied. A shrug. Now the Englishman is dead, and the site is under their control. Convenient, no. Price let his gaze drift to the bar, as though oblivious, but inwardly the words brought some things to light. Armand, the French archaeologist mentioned by Blackwood, had clearly not been on friendly terms with Sir Charles. He finished his drink and was about to leave when a shadow fell across his table. Clara White stood there, her linen dress freshly pressed, a faint scent of jasmine clinging to her. "I thought you might be here," she said. Price gestured to the seat opposite. "Will you join me?" She sat, glancing briefly at the Frenchman before turning back to him. "You've been to the site now. Do you believe it was heat stroke?" Price studied her face, noting the tension in her jaw. "No, I think Sir Charles was silenced. Whether by design or opportunity remains to be seen." Her hands tightened around the stem of her glass. "Then you should be careful. There are people here who would do anything to protect what they found." "People such as?" She hesitated. "Professor Armand, certainly. Colonel Rutherford, perhaps. And—" She trailed off, her eyes shifting to the entrance. Price followed her gaze. A tall man in a white suit had just entered the lounge, his movements deliberate, his eyes sweeping the room before resting on Clara. He inclined his head in a way that was almost a challenge. "Who is he?" Price asked quietly. "Ahmed Nassar," Clara replied, "an antiquities dealer with connections. He and Sir Charles had dealings. I don't know the nature of them, but I doubt they were entirely legal. Later, Price returned to his room. The night air was still warm. The hum of the street below softened by distance. He stepped onto the balcony to draw in a lungful of cooler air, and froze. Across the street, half shrouded in shadow, a figure stood motionless beneath a street lamp. The man wore a dark suit, his face hidden beneath the brim of his hat. He was looking directly at Price. For a long moment, neither moved. Then, with a slow, deliberate turn, the man melted into the alleyway and was gone. Price lingered on the balcony. Someone was watching, and they wanted him to know it. Chapter 5. A Fatal Toast. The invitation arrived by hand the following morning, a stiff cream card bearing the gold-embossed seal of the British Consulate. In elegant script it read, "The Honourable Henry Blackwood requests the pleasure of your company at dinner in honour of our esteemed guests, to be held in the grand dining room of the Consulate, 8 o'clock this evening." Inspector Harold Price had attended enough such functions to know that the real purpose of this honour was rarely social. In colonial outposts such as Cairo, the dinner table could serve as both diplomatic stage and battlefield. By the time Price arrived, the sky was a sheet of deep violet, the air heavy with the scent of night-blooming jasmine. The Consulate's courtyard blazed with light from oil lamps hung between palm trees. Footmen in crisp white livery stood ready to escort guests inside, their polished shoes glinting in the glow. The grand dining room was a study in polished elegance, its long mahogany table set with silver candelabra, crystal decanters, and an extravagant arrangement of lilies. Around it gathered a carefully chosen mix of diplomats, military officers, scholars, and society ladies. Price noted the presence of several familiar faces: Colonel James Rutherford, standing stiffly by the mantel, Professor Lucien Armand, his dark moustache twitching in irritation as he conversed with a French attaché, and Clara White, seated near the far end of the table, her pale dress a deliberate contrast to the darker tones around her. Blackwood, ever the charming host, greeted Price warmly and ushered him toward a seat midway down the table. "I've placed you between Miss White and Major Sinclair," he murmured. "The former will give you insight into the matter at hand. The latter, well, perhaps more insight than you desire." Dinner began with a chilled soup, followed by delicately spiced lamb, stewed vegetables, and baskets of warm bread. The conversation flowed politely at first: Egypt's heat, the latest arrivals from London, rumours of a new railway line. But beneath it Price felt the subtle undercurrents, glances exchanged, pauses that lasted a fraction too long, the careful avoidance of certain topics. It was during the second course that Professor Armand made his first pointed remark. Leaning back in his chair, he said loudly enough for several nearby guests to hear, of course, had Sir Charles been more generous in sharing his findings, perhaps he would still be alive today. The table went still for a heartbeat. Colonel Rutherford's jaw tightened. Clara's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Dangerous ground, Professor," Price said evenly. "Speculation can be a treacherous thing, especially in mixed company." Armand smiled thinly. "Ah, but speculation is all we have, is it not? The truth, I fear, has been buried along with him." After dessert, a fragrant pudding laced with dates and honey, Blackwood rose for the customary toast. "To the continued friendship between our nations," he declared, raising his glass, "and to the safe and fruitful completion of the excavation begun by our dear Sir Charles Winthrop." Crystal glasses were lifted all around. Price took a measured sip, his eyes scanning the room. Clara drank sparingly, her gaze fixed on her glass. Rutherford drained his in a single swallow. It was Major Sinclair who suddenly coughed, choked, and doubled over. At first the guests laughed nervously, assuming he'd swallowed the wrong way, but the laughter died as his face turned an alarming shade of purple. "Quickly!" Price barked, leaping to his feet. Chairs scraped back, and a footman hurried forward, but it was too late. Sinclair's body sagged against the table, his glass shattering to the floor. Price caught him under the arms, lowering him to the carpet. There was no doubt the man was dead. Chaos erupted. Guests murmured in shock, some rising from their seats, others pressing hands to their mouths. Blackwood quickly restored order, instructing the servants to clear the room. Price remained kneeling beside Sinclair, his eyes narrowing. The symptoms, sudden collapse, rapid discoloration, were consistent with poisoning. His gaze swept the table. The Major's glass still lay in shards, but the scent of almonds lingered faintly in the air above it. Cyanide. Quick, lethal, and almost impossible to detect once in the bloodstream. Later, in Blackwood's study, the host's expression was grim. This cannot be coincidence, Price. First Sir Charles, now Sinclair? Perhaps not, Price said, but the question is whether Sinclair was the intended victim or whether the poison was meant for someone else. Clara White stood by the window, her face pale. If it was meant for someone else, Price looked at her, then the killer has made one mistake too many, and I intend to find it. Chapter 6. The Map and the Mirage. The events at the Consulate dinner had left a palpable unease hanging over Cairo's expatriate circles. In the cafes and shaded courtyards, whispers grew more fevered. The curse had claimed another life. The tomb was dangerous to all who touched it. Someone, depending on the storyteller, was next. Inspector Harold Price had little patience for curses, but he recognised the danger of such talk. Fear clouded judgment, and a fearful man could be driven to violence just as readily as a desperate one. The morning after the dinner, Price rose before dawn, the city still quiet, save for the distant call to prayer drifting on the cool air. Clara White had agreed to meet him at the excavation site, insisting she had something to show him. They travelled upriver once more, the Nile gleaming under the pale light of early morning. The felucca cut smoothly through the water, and the desert cliffs loomed ahead, turning gold as the sun climbed higher. At the site, the camp was already alive with activity, labourers shifting sand, the rhythmic scrape of tools echoing in the dry air. Colonel Rutherford was nowhere to be seen, but Professor Armand was directing a small team near the entrance of the tomb, his voice sharp. Clara led Price to the storage tent, where she rummaged through a locked chest and produced a bundle wrapped in linen. She unrolled it with care, revealing a torn fragment of ancient papyrus, its edges ragged and browned with age. "I found this 2 days before Sir Charles died," she said. "It was tucked inside one of the storage crates, hidden under pottery shards. I don't believe Sir Charles knew I had it." Price examined the fragment. The hieroglyphs were intricate, but what caught his attention was the crude ink sketch overlaying them. Lines and symbols that formed a rough diagram. "A map," Price murmured. Clara nodded. "It matches the main burial chamber we uncovered. But here," she pointed to a faint marking, "is something we haven't found yet. A hidden passage." Price's mind ticked over. If Sir Charles discovered this, it would explain a great deal. Knowledge like this could be worth a fortune to the right buyer, or the wrong one. They stepped outside, the sun now fully overhead, its glare bouncing off the pale rock. Price moved toward the tomb entrance to inspect the area himself. Near the scaffolding that supported part of the dig's slope, he crouched to study the ground, and heard a faint creak above him. He looked up just as a section of timber groaned and gave way. A split second of instinct sent him diving aside, rolling across the sand as a cascade of planks and debris crashed where he'd been standing. The impact sent up a choking cloud of dust, the shouts of workers echoing off the cliffs. "Inspector!" Clara's voice cut through the din as she ran toward him, her face pale. "Are you hurt?" Price got to his feet, brushing sand from his coat. "No, but someone will be if I find this was deliberate." He turned to see Professor Armand standing a few yards away, his expression unreadable. "A most unfortunate accident," Armand said smoothly. Price's eyes narrowed. "Yes, unfortunate and curious." That evening back in Cairo, Price spread the map fragment on his desk at Shepheard's. He compared it with the official excavation plans. There was no mention of the hidden passage. Someone had gone to great lengths to keep it secret. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. When he opened it, a bellboy stood holding a sealed envelope. "From the lobby, sir, left for you by a gentleman in a dark suit." Inside was a single line written in a hurried hand. "Leave the tomb alone, or you will not leave Egypt alive." Price read it twice, then folded it slowly and slipped it into his pocket. The mirage of accidents was gone. This was a deliberate game, and the killer had just shown their hand. Chapter 7. Beneath the Desert Sun. The following day dawned mercilessly bright. Inspector Price sat alone on the veranda of Shepheard's hotel, nursing a cup of bitter coffee and reviewing his plan. The warning note in his pocket was no deterrent. It was an invitation. Whoever had sent it was rattled, and rattled adversaries made mistakes. By mid-morning, Price was on his way back to the Valley of the Kings. He had already instructed Colonel Rutherford, in the vaguest possible terms, to have all excavation halted for the day. The workers had been dismissed early, their absence leaving the site eerily still. Only Price, Clara White, Rutherford, and a small detachment of guards remained. The sun was climbing toward its zenith. The desert shimmered in waves, the heat pressing down like a physical weight. Price gathered the others near the entrance of the tomb. "Today," he said, "we will see who truly owns the secrets of this place." The plan was simple in design, dangerous in execution. Price had spread word, through channels he knew would reach the culprit, that the tomb would be opened at midday for the transfer of artifacts to the Consulate. No such transfer was planned, but if his instincts were correct, the lure would be irresistible. The hidden passage, as marked on the fragment of papyrus, was the key. If the murderer wanted it for themselves, they would come for it now, when they believed the site lightly guarded and the heat enough to deter casual onlookers. Price, Clara, and Rutherford took up positions inside the main chamber, cloaked in the cool dimness beneath the earth. Outside, the air burned white with sunlight. For a long while, there was nothing but the whisper of sand shifting at the entrance. Then a shadow passed across the light. The figure that entered was alone, moving with practiced confidence. A wide-brimmed hat shaded their face, but the set of the shoulders and the deliberate pace told Price all he needed to know. Professor Lucien Armand. He moved to the far wall of the chamber, directly to the spot where the map indicated the hidden passage should be. From beneath his coat, he withdrew a small chisel and began to work swiftly, his breathing quick in the still air. Price stepped forward. "I believe that's not yours, Professor." Armand froze, the chisel half raised. "Inspector, I was merely—" "Stealing the find of another man?" Price's voice was calm, but the echo in the chamber gave it an edge. "Just as you attempted to do before Sir Charles's death." Armand straightened slowly, his eyes narrowing. "You have no proof." Price's gaze was steady. "You quarrelled with Sir Charles because he discovered this passage before you. You feared he would publish before you could. So you waited until the day he worked here alone, in the hottest part of the day. You followed him. Perhaps you offered him water, laced with something swift and deadly. The heat would conceal the cause." Armand's lip curled. "You have an active imagination, Inspector." "Not imagination, deduction," Price replied. "The missing pages from Sir Charles's notebook were found in your tent this morning, along with a piece of papyrus torn to match the fragment Miss White discovered. You tried to kill me yesterday to keep me from finding this, and last night's note was your final mistake." Armand's eyes flicked toward the entrance. Price's hand dropped, almost casually, to the revolver at his side. "You won't make it 3 steps, Professor," he said evenly. Colonel Rutherford emerged from the shadows behind him, 2 guards at his side. "Best drop the chisel," he said. Armand hesitated, then let it fall with a clatter to the stone floor. His voice, when it came, was low and bitter. "Charles thought he owned history. He would have dug it up, put it behind glass, and called it a British discovery. At least I would have put it to good use." Price regarded him coolly. "Murder is a poor sort of use for history." Outside, the heat struck them like a wall as they led Armand away. The valley lay silent under the blazing noon sun, the cliffs standing as they had for thousands of years, indifferent to the greed and folly of men. Chapter 8. Justice in the Valley of Kings. The return to Cairo was swift and without ceremony. Professor Lucien Armand, his once pristine linen suit now rumpled, sat in silence between two guards in the motor car. The streets of the city unfolded before them, narrow lanes spilling into wide boulevards. Yet Armand kept his gaze fixed ahead, his jaw tight. At the British Consulate, Henry Blackwood was waiting in the study, the shutters drawn against the afternoon heat. Price delivered his report with the precision of a man accustomed to courtroom scrutiny. Armand's tent contained the missing notebook pages, detailing the hidden passage's location, along with the torn section of papyrus Miss White recovered. The timing of Sir Charles's death matches a window in which Armand was unaccounted for. And finally, the attempt on my life at the site yesterday, the scaffolding, was engineered with deliberate cuts to the supporting timber. Blackwood listened without interruption, his fingers steepled. When Price finished, he allowed himself a short breath. It will be handled discreetly. The French consul will have to be informed, of course. They won't like it, but the evidence is inconvenient to ignore. From her place near the window, Clara White spoke for the first time. And the tomb? Sealed, Price said, until a joint expedition can resume under the supervision of both British and Egyptian authorities. He paused, regarding her. I trust you'll see it completed. Her eyes met his, steady and resolute. I will. Sir Charles devoted his life to it. I owe him at least that. That evening, Price took a solitary walk through the Khan el-Khalili market, the labyrinth of narrow streets, alive with traders calling out their wares, spices, silks, jewellery that glittered under the lantern light. The air was thick with the scent of incense and roasting nuts, the hum of barter and laughter, a sharp contrast to the dry silence of the valley. The case, like so many, had hinged on the simplest of truths, a man's greed eclipsing his reason. Yet here, in a city that had seen centuries of empire and ruin, Price could not help but reflect on how little the motives of men had changed. The desert had swallowed kings, armies, and civilizations whole, but it was still no match for ambition. The next morning, Price boarded the SS Olympia, bound for London. Clara White was there to see him off, her hat's brim casting a shadow over her face. You've been a steady ally, Miss White, Price said as they shook hands, and perhaps, one day, when your work here is complete, you'll tell me what was on those missing notebook pages before Armand ever touched them. A faint smile curved her lips. Perhaps one day, Inspector, but some secrets belong to the desert. The gangway was raised, the ship's whistle sounding its mournful farewell. Price stood at the rail as Alexandria receded, a shimmer of white and gold against the blue. The case was closed, the murderer unmasked, and justice, in its measured way, served. But as the coastline faded, he knew the desert still held its share of mysteries. And somewhere, beneath the blazing sun, another secret was already waiting to be uncovered.